Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories that got the community really fired up. We reviewed 25 stories from the front page, and I've picked the 5 that sparked the most interesting discussions and debates. We've got quite a mix today, from billion-euro AI investments that might be more about politics than technology, to supply chain attacks that had developers thanking their procrastination habits, to Apple's latest attempt at making phones impossibly thin while somehow still having that camera bump. Plus, we'll look at how law enforcement is using fake cell towers to track people, and Anthropic's interesting decision to re-release an old feature as something new. What really struck me going through these stories is how they all touch on this tension between what's technically possible and what we actually want or need. Whether it's European AI sovereignty, JavaScript security, or phone design, there's this recurring theme of solutions looking for problems, or worse, creating new ones while trying to solve the old ones. So let's jump right in with our biggest story of the day. A massive funding round that has people asking whether Europe can really compete in the AI race, or if this is just expensive theater.
Now, on paper, this partnership makes a certain kind of sense. Mistral says they're going to develop custom decentralized frontier AI solutions. And yes, that's a mouthful of buzzwords, but specifically for solving complex engineering problems in the semiconductor industry. Think about it. Modern chip design and manufacturing is already pushing the boundaries of physics. You've got billions of transistors, quantum effects becoming significant at these scales, and the whole process requires incredible precision. So having AI help optimize these processes, that could be huge. But here's where the Hacker News crowd got really skeptical, and I think they raised some valid points. A lot of commenters are saying this feels more like a strategic or even political play than a pure technical partnership. See, Europe doesn't really have a major player in the AI race right now. You've got OpenAI, Anthropic, Google and Meta dominating in the US, and then China has its own ecosystem with companies like DeepSeek making waves. Mistral is kind of it for Europe. They're the only game in town at this scale. One commenter put it pretty bluntly. They said ASML might just be buying political favor here. Think about it from ASML's perspective. They're this critical player in the global semiconductor supply chain. They're European, and there's all this talk about AI sovereignty and not being dependent on American or Chinese AI systems. Supporting Mistral could be as much about maintaining good relationships with European regulators and governments as it is about any specific technical integration. And then there's the technical reality check. Mistral is, look, they're good, but they're not OpenAI. They're probably a generation behind in terms of model capabilities. Their latest models are competitive with maybe GPT 3.5 or early GPT-4 level, while OpenAI is already talking about reasoning models and whatever comes after GPT-4. The funding gap is massive too. Even with this 1.7 billion euros, they're still way behind what OpenAI has raised. We're talking about David versus multiple Goliaths here. But, and this is where it gets interesting, there were some optimistic voices in the discussion too. Some folks pointed out that the conventional AI scaling approach, just throw more compute and data at the problem, might be hitting diminishing returns. Maybe Mistral, being forced to be more efficient with less resources, could stumble onto the next breakthrough. Someone brought up DeepSeek as an example. They came out of nowhere with some really impressive efficiency improvements. There's also this whole angle about decentralization that Mistral keeps emphasizing. They're positioning themselves as the independent option, not tied to Microsoft like OpenAI, not part of Google or Meta's ecosystem. For European companies, governments, and especially regulated industries, that independence might be worth paying a premium for, even if the models aren't quite state-of-the-art. The ASML partnership specifically is where things get murky, though. Like, what exactly is Mistral going to do for ASML's lithography business? The press release talks about solving complex engineering challenges, but ASML already has some of the world's best engineers and physicists. They're not exactly hurting for technical talent. Some commenters speculated it might be about using AI for predictive maintenance or optimizing the incredibly complex supply chains involved in building these machines. Or maybe even helping with the computational lithography problems where you're trying to figure out exactly how light will behave at these nanometer scales. But honestly, the vagueness of the announcement makes it feel like they don't really know yet. It's more like, hey, AI is important, semiconductors are important, let's figure out how they work together. Which, fair enough. Sometimes that's how innovation happens. What really struck me about the community reaction was this underlying tension about European tech competitiveness. There's clearly a desire to see Europe succeed in AI, to not be completely dependent on American or Chinese systems. But there's also this realistic assessment that throwing money at the problem might not be enough when you're this far behind. It's not just about the funding. It's about talent, compute infrastructure, data access, and ecosystem effects. One particularly insightful comment pointed out that governments worldwide are probably going to actively support non-US AI alternatives regardless of technical merit, just for strategic reasons. So Mistral might have a guaranteed market even if they never catch up technically. That's kind of depressing if you think about it from a pure innovation standpoint, but it's probably realistic given the geopolitical implications of AI. The 11.7 billion euro valuation also raised some eyebrows. That's a lot for a company that's basically the fourth or fifth player in a market where network effects and scale advantages are everything. But then again, if you're a European investor or government, what's the alternative? Just give up and use American AI forever? There's a strategic value to having a domestic option that might justify the premium.
Speaking of AI companies and their interesting business decisions, let's talk about Anthropic's latest move with Claude. Because this one has users scratching their heads about what's actually new versus what's just repackaged. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd pretty fired up. Claude now has access to a server-side container environment. And honestly, the more I dig into this one, the more fascinating it gets because, well, it's not quite what it seems on the surface. So here's what Anthropic is announcing. They're giving Claude the ability to create actual files. We're talking Excel spreadsheets with working formulas, PowerPoint presentations, PDFs, Word documents, the whole Microsoft Office suite, basically. And this isn't just Claude spitting out text that you then have to copy-paste somewhere. No, Claude is actually creating these files in a private, server-side container where it can write and execute code to produce the real deal. Now, if you're a Max, Team, or Enterprise user, you've got this in preview right now. Pro users, you're looking at a few more weeks. But here's where things get interesting and a bit controversial. See, the way this works is that Claude now has access to what Anthropic calls a private computer environment, essentially a sandbox container where it can actually run Python code, manipulate data, create visualizations, and output finished files. Think about what that means for a second. You could dump raw sales data into Claude and say, turn this into a quarterly report with charts. And boom, you get a polished PowerPoint deck ready for your board meeting. But here's the thing that's got people riled up in the comments. This isn't actually new. User Alex Schuler pointed out something that made me do a double take. Claude had this exact capability back in June, and then Anthropic removed it. So they're essentially re-releasing a feature they took away and marketing it as innovation. That's not great optics, right? And it gets weirder. They're replacing their existing JavaScript-based analysis tool with this Python container system. Not supplementing, replacing. So if you had workflows built around the old system, tough luck. Several users are scratching their heads about why they couldn't just, keep both.
The performance issues are what's really getting under people's skin, though. Multiple Pro and Max subscribers are reporting that Claude has become significantly slower over the past few weeks. We're talking about throttling,
artifacts that won't edit properly, and general sluggishness that's making the service borderline unusable for some folks. One user mentioned they're hitting rate limits after just a handful of messages, which, for a paid service, that's rough. Now, the comparison everyone's making is to ChatGPT's code interpreter, which has been doing this kind of thing for a while now. Some users are saying Claude is just playing catch-up, while others argue that Claude's implementation might be more sophisticated or reliable, though given the performance complaints, reliable might be a stretch right now. There's this really interesting philosophical debate happening in the comments, too. User Lord Nacho brought up something I hadn't considered. What happens when creating complex business documents becomes as easy as having a conversation? On one hand, you've got democratization of technical skills. Someone who's never touched Excel can now create complex financial models. That's powerful. But on the flip side, and this is where it gets dark, what if managers start demanding 10 times the deliverables just because they can be generated quickly? What if we end up drowning in an avalanche of crap, as Lord Nacho put it? There's something to be said for the friction that exists when creating these documents requires actual expertise and time. The security implications are pretty wild, too. We're talking about an AI system that can execute code in a container environment. Yes, it's sandboxed, but we've all seen how well sandboxes hold up when someone really wants to break out of them. Anthropic says it's private and secure, but the technical details are pretty sparse on exactly how they're ensuring that. What really strikes me about this whole situation is the messaging disconnect. Anthropic is presenting this as a breakthrough feature that transforms Claude from a text assistant into a productivity powerhouse. Meanwhile, their actual users are saying, you already did this months ago, and also the service has been getting worse lately, not better. It feels like there's a broader pattern here with AI companies, this constant need to announce new features and capabilities, even if it means recycling old ones or degrading existing functionality. The pressure to stay relevant in the AI arms race is real, but at what point does it start hurting more than helping? For what it's worth, the actual capability here is impressive. Being able to conversationally create complex documents and data visualizations is genuinely useful. But the execution, the communication, the timing, it's all a bit of a mess. And when you're charging premium prices for a Pro or Max subscription, users have every right to expect better. Now, speaking of security concerns and sandboxed environments, let's shift gears to a story that had developers everywhere breathing a collective sigh of relief and maybe reconsidering their update strategies. All right, so our next story is titled "We All Dodged a Bullet." And wow, this one had the Hacker News community buzzing with over 600 points and hundreds of comments. This is about a recent NPM supply chain attack that could have been absolutely catastrophic for, well, basically anyone using JavaScript packages. So here's what went down. Multiple popular NPM packages got compromised. We're talking about packages like DuckDB, Debug, and Chalk. These aren't some obscure libraries nobody uses. These are packages with millions of downloads. The attackers managed to inject malicious code that was stealing credentials and cryptocurrency. And the scary part? The way they pulled it off was surprisingly sophisticated in some ways and surprisingly simple in others. The attack started with phishing emails that looked incredibly legitimate. They came from an npm.help domain, not npm.com, but npm.help, which, let's be honest, could easily fool someone who's multitasking or just not paying super close attention. These emails convinced maintainers to click through and enter their credentials, and boom, the attackers had the keys to the kingdom. What's fascinating about the community reaction is this recurring theme of saved by procrastination. I mean, multiple commenters were basically saying, "Thank goodness I'm lazy about updating my dependencies." One person joked that their technical debt actually saved them this time. It's kind of hilarious, but also deeply concerning that being slow to update has become a legitimate security strategy in the JavaScript ecosystem. And speaking of the JavaScript ecosystem, there's this heated debate in the comments about whether NPM is uniquely vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. One commenter flat out said, "This is the only ecosystem where this regularly happens." And they're not entirely wrong. The way NPM works with its massive dependency trees and the culture of using tiny packages for everything, it creates this huge attack surface that other language ecosystems just don't have to the same degree.
But here's where it gets interesting. There's this contrarian view from a commenter named Zach, who's basically saying, look, if you're following proper security hygiene, you wouldn't fall for this. Their argument is that you should never, ever click email links to enter credentials. Always navigate to the site directly. And you know what? They've got a point. But then again, when you're maintaining dozens of packages and you're getting what looks like a legitimate security alert from NPM, the pressure to act quickly can override those best practices. Another fascinating angle that came up, and this really made me think, is why the attackers only deployed relatively simple crypto stealers. I mean, think about it. They had access to packages that millions of developers use. They could have injected something way more sophisticated, something that could have compromised entire corporate networks or stolen source code, or the possibilities are terrifying. One commenter, Seb Stefan, pointed out that this suggests the attack was actually pretty unsophisticated, given the opportunity they had. Maybe they were just crypto thieves who got lucky, not nation-state actors or sophisticated criminal organizations. The whole incident really highlights this fundamental tension in modern software development. We've built this incredible ecosystem where you can pull in thousands of packages with a single command, standing on the shoulders of giants and all that. But each one of those packages is a potential security vulnerability. And the maintainers of these packages, they're often doing this for free in their spare time, without the resources for proper security audits or even basic two-factor authentication in some cases. What's particularly sobering is that this wasn't some zero-day exploit or sophisticated technical hack. This was social engineering, plain and simple. And it worked because maintainers are human beings who make mistakes, especially when they're overworked and underfunded. The fact that we're celebrating dodging this bullet instead of discussing how to fundamentally fix these systemic issues, that's the real story here. You know, reading through these comments, there's this mix of relief and dread. Relief from the people who weren't affected this time, and dread because everyone knows it's not a matter of if the next attack will happen, but when. And next time, we might not be so lucky to dodge that bullet. And speaking of surveillance and security vulnerabilities, our next story takes us from the digital supply chain to physical surveillance, where law enforcement is using some pretty controversial tech to track people down.
All right, so our next story hits on something that's been bubbling up in tech circles for years, but just got a whole lot more concrete. ICE is using fake cell towers to spy on people's phones. And folks, this one really struck a nerve on Hacker News with over 500 points and more than 200 comments because it touches on that fundamental tension between security and privacy that we're all grappling with. So here's what's happening. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has been using these devices called cell site simulators, you might know them as stingrays, to track people down. And a recently unsealed search warrant just gave us a window into exactly how they're doing it. They were hunting for this Venezuelan guy who'd escaped from prison while serving a murder sentence and was supposed to have left the country back in 2023. Now, let me explain what these Stingray devices actually do, because it's pretty wild when you think about it. They basically masquerade as legitimate cell towers. Your phone, my phone, everyone's phone is constantly looking for the strongest signal, right? These devices exploit that by broadcasting a stronger signal than the real towers nearby, so phones automatically connect to them instead. And once your phone connects, boom, they've got your location and potentially a whole lot more. What's fascinating about this particular case is how it shows the escalation of surveillance tech. ICE started with traditional location tracking methods, but they could only narrow this guy down to about a 30-block area in Orem, Utah. That's a lot of ground to cover. So they went to court and said, hey,
we need to use the big guns here, and got approval to deploy the Stingray. But here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, kind of concerning. These devices don't just connect to the target's phone. They're essentially creating a dragnet that catches everyone in the area. If you're walking your dog past that 30-block zone, if you're grabbing coffee, if you're just living your life, your phone might be connecting to this fake tower too. The Hacker News community really latched onto this Fourth Amendment angle, and I get why. It's this question of, are we okay with mass surveillance if it means catching dangerous criminals? The technical folks on Hacker News, though, went straight into problem-solving mode, which I love. There's this huge discussion about how to detect these things. The EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, just released this open-source tool called Ray Hunter that can supposedly detect IMSI catchers, which is what these stingrays technically are. People are sharing implementation details, talking about accessibility, really getting into the weeds on how regular people might protect themselves.
And you know what's wild? This isn't even new technology. Commenters were pointing out that these devices were being used at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests back in 2016. The federal government's been acquiring them under multiple administrations. It's just we're only now getting these glimpses through unsealed warrants of how routinely they're being deployed. Now, there was this interesting split in the comments that I think reflects a bigger societal debate. You had one commenter, XP84, making the case that, look, if there's a proper warrant and we're talking about tracking down a murderer who escaped from prison, isn't this exactly when we want law enforcement to have effective tools? They pointed out that wiretaps have been around for 75 years, and, we haven't descended into fascism because of them. But then you've got the other side saying, hold up, this is fundamentally different. A wiretap targets a specific person's specific phone line. A stingray is more like, imagine if to wiretap one person, the FBI had to listen in on every phone call in your neighborhood first, then filter out the one they want. The collateral surveillance is baked into how the technology works. Jump Crisscross had this really pragmatic take that stuck with me. They basically said, look, if we're going to criticize ICE, let's focus on the actual abuses, the family separations, the detention conditions, the deportations of people who've lived here for decades. Getting worked up about warrant-based searches for escaped murderers might actually dilute the message about the real problems. What really gets me thinking, though, is how this technology represents this shift in what's technically possible versus what's legally permissible versus what's socially acceptable. The technology exists, law enforcement wants to use it, courts are approving it with warrants, but we as a society haven't really had that conversation about where the boundaries should be. And meanwhile, the capability gap between what authorities can do and what citizens can detect or prevent, it just keeps growing wider. The fact that we're only learning about this through unsealed warrants years after the fact, that tells you everything about the transparency problem we're dealing with here. How can we have an informed debate about surveillance powers when we don't even know how they're being used until long after the fact?
All right, so our next story is about Apple's just announced iPhone Air. And wow, the Hacker News crowd has some thoughts about this one. This pulled in over 580 points and more than 1,200 comments, which tells you right away that people have strong feelings here. So Apple's doing something interesting. They're bringing the Air branding from their MacBook line over to the iPhone. And just like with the MacBooks, this is all about being impossibly thin and light. They're calling it the thinnest iPhone ever made with this new titanium design and something called Ceramic Shield 2 technology. The marketing copy is, well, it's very Apple. They literally say, you really have to hold it to believe it's real. September 19th, 2025, launch date if you're marking your calendars. But here's where it gets technically interesting, and also where the community starts raising eyebrows. Apple's claiming they've achieved this revolutionary thinness through what they're calling breakthrough titanium design and innovative internal architecture. Now, anyone who's followed smartphone engineering knows that making phones thinner it's not just about materials. You've got battery constraints, thermal management, structural integrity. There's a reason phones haven't gotten dramatically thinner in recent years. The spec sheet is actually pretty impressive, though. We're talking a 6.5-inch ProMotion display, which is nice, but the real story is this triple custom silicon approach they're taking. They've got the A19 Pro chip, plus something called the N1 and C1X chips, and Apple's calling this the most Apple-designed chips in an iPhone. I love that phrasing. Like, what does that even mean? But supposedly, this combo makes it the most power-efficient iPhone ever made. Now, the Hacker News discussion is where things get spicy. The top comment, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this captures the sentiment perfectly, basically points out the absolute irony of marketing an impossibly thin phone when you've still got that massive camera bump sticking out the back. Like, sure, the phone body might be 4.7 millimeters or whatever, but when you put it on the table, it's still wobbling around because of that camera system. Multiple users are pointing out that the effective thickness is really the camera bump thickness, not the body thickness. And this speaks to a larger frustration that's bubbling up in the comments. People are asking, who actually wants this? Like, when was the last time you heard someone complain their phone was too thick? The consistent feedback year after year has been, give us better battery life, not make it thinner. There's this interesting tension where Apple seems to be solving problems that users don't actually have.
But, and this is important, there are some genuinely exciting technical advances here. The A19 Pro chip apparently has some serious AI chops. One commenter who seems to know their stuff points out that the matmul acceleration in this chip could make iPhones and future Macs actually viable for local LLM inferencing. That's huge, if true. We're talking about running legitimate AI models on device without needing cloud connectivity. The camera system is also noteworthy: 48-megapixel main camera, 18-megapixel front camera with this center stage feature, and for the first time they're putting ceramic shield on the back of the phone too, not just the front. They're claiming 3x better scratch resistance, which, look, we'll see when the drop test videos come out, right? There's this fascinating comment thread about whether this is actually Apple testing the market. Like they've heard the feedback about wanting thinner phones for years, so they're finally delivering it to see if people actually buy it. One user called it as good as it gets for incremental updates, and they're genuinely excited about it, but they're definitely in the minority. The naming is interesting too. iPhone Air. It suggests this might be positioning between the regular iPhone and the Pro models, focusing on portability and elegance rather than raw power and features. Though with that A19 Pro chip, it doesn't seem like they're compromising on performance. What really strikes me about this whole discussion is how it highlights the disconnect between what companies think we want and what we actually want. Several commenters are practically begging for an iPhone mini comeback. They want smaller phones, not thinner ones. The form factor diversity that Android offers just isn't there in the Apple ecosystem, and people are feeling that constraint. The battery life claims are optimistic. Apple says it will still deliver all-day battery life despite being the thinnest iPhone ever. The physics of that are challenging, to put it mildly. Either they've made some breakthrough in battery technology, which would be huge news on its own, or their definition of all day might be getting a bit creative. You know what's funny? Nobody's really talking about the price, which usually dominates these discussions. It's like everyone's so focused on whether this should exist at all that they haven't even gotten to whether it's worth buying. That's actually pretty telling about where consumer sentiment is right now with incremental smartphone updates. And that wraps up today's deep dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. What really strikes me looking across all of these is this recurring pattern, from Mistral's billion-euro funding to Apple's ultra-thin iPhone to Anthropic's recycled features, of solutions desperately searching for problems. We've got European investors throwing money at AI sovereignty, even if the tech isn't there yet, Apple making phones thinner when everyone wants better batteries, and Anthropic re-releasing old features as new innovations. Meanwhile, the real problems, like NPM's security nightmare and mass surveillance through fake cell towers, those are getting band-aid fixes at best. The Hacker News community's response to all of this has been fascinating, equal parts skepticism, dark humor, and genuine concern about where all this is heading. Whether it's celebrating being saved by procrastination from a supply chain attack, or pointing out that a phone's actual thickness includes the camera bump, there's this collective sense that maybe, just maybe, we need to stop and ask whether we're building the future we actually want. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you want to dive deeper into any of these stories, head over to Hacker News, where these discussions are still going strong. And remember, sometimes the best security strategy is apparently just being too lazy to update your dependencies. Though, maybe don't make that your official policy. Until tomorrow, keep questioning, keep building, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. This has been your Hacker News Daily Podcast. Take care, everyone.